What is wrong with this sort of utopianism is not that there's something wrong about speculating about possibilities that we're not presently able to realize when we're able to make clear just what the hypothetical possibilities are. Such speculation is as old as philosophy itself. The problem is that it's completely unclear just what possibility is being envisaged when one speaks of a normal form description of the psychology of an arbitrary organism. And the talk about the program of psychology and about what is an inevitable part of the program of psychology was, I blush to admit, a way of hiding this sorry state of affairs, hiding it in the first instance from myself. The degree of utopianism required to be a functionalist becomes all the greater when one recognizes something that I had myself emphasized in my writings on the philosophy of language, namely that the meanings of our words, and I argued, and we'll be talking about that in these coming lectures, the content of our thoughts as well, are not determined simply by our functional organization in the sense in which I've been speaking of functional organization, that is, our sensory inputs, transitions from one state to another, and motor outputs. According to the semantic externalism that I defended and still defend, the content of our words and thoughts is partly determined by our relations with things in our environment, including other people. We will come to that later. The fact that what causes us to speak of water is water and not some other liquid has everything to do with the fact that the word water refers to water. Although I did not discuss this in the functionalist papers, I was of course aware of it. What I would have said if someone had asked, isn't your functionalism incompatible with your semantic externalism? Is it, strictly speaking, an ideal psychological theory? Has to be not a theory of one organism in isolation, but a theory of a group of organisms, and has to include a description of their interactions with one another and with their environment, and of the nature of the relevant parts of that environment. In conversation, Richard Boyd suggested the name socio-functionalism for this position. But the stipulation that the ideal psychological theory must include, properly speaking, also an ideal sociolinguistic theory makes the idea of such a theory, if possible, even more utopian. Thus, it's not surprising that by the middle 1980s, I began seriously to ask myself how meaningful, even as a regulative ideal, is the idea of an ideal psychological cum sociolinguistic theory that individuates all possible psychological states. Let us go back to the robot who was supposed to be psychologically isomorphic to a human being. Call it Leslie. Suppose we observe that Leslie produces the sound, or human if you prefer, it produces the sound shell egg when it snows. Especially when the snow is unexpected, and Leslie exhibits a startled reaction at the onset of snow, he's likely to exclaim, "shell egg." At least it seems to us like an exclamation. It might be well be part of the ideal psychological theory we postulated that under normal conditions an organism who has the belief that it is snowing in its conceptual repertoire will be caused to have that belief by the onset of snow. It is compatible with that piece of the ideal psychological theory that Leslie may believe that it is snowing on these occasions, and that Leslie may be expressing that belief by saying or thinking shell egg. Unfortunately, there are a host of other possibilities. Suppose, for example, Leslie and his fellow robots have a religion of a rather primitive kind. Remember, Leslie's sort of robot is psychologically isomorphic to human beings. And it's the peculiarity of this religion that snow is a sure sign that the gods are angry. In such a case, shell egg might well mean the gods are angry. The reply of the functionist, of course, will be that still Leslie's total internal goings-on will be different in some way from the internal goings-on of a robot that thinks it's snowing when it says shell egg. If we knew the totality of the robot's internal goings-on, and we knew the ideal psychological theory, we would be able to determine that the content of shell egg thoughts is the gods are angry and not it's snowing. What does this require of the ideal psychological theory? It requires that the ideal psychological theory be rich enough to describe the beliefs of a believer in any possible religion, however unfamiliar. Or Leslie may not be a believer in a primitive religion. The robot may be a super scientist. It may be saying quantum state such and such when it snows, or making a comment in a physical theory we don't have yet. In short, it looks as if an ideal psychological theory, a theory that would be able to determine the content of an arbitrary thought, would have to be able to describe every belief of every possible kind, or at least every human belief of every possible kind, even of kinds that are not yet invented, or that go with institutions that have not yet come into existence. More and more the suspicion grows that such a theory is a pure we know not what. What I think finally pushed me over the anti-functionalist edge was a conversation I had one day with Noam Chomsky, and this was really my reaction to that conversation was my first lecture in this series. Chomsky suggested that the difference between a rational or a well-confirmed belief and a belief that is not rational or not well-confirmed might be determined by rules that are innate in the human brain. It struck me at once that it ought to be fairly easy to show, using the techniques one uses to prove the Gödel theorem, that if Chomsky is right, we could never discover that he's right. And that was, of course, the burden of the first lecture in the series. That is to say, if what is rational and not rational to believe is determined by a recursive procedure, which is specified in our ideal competence description D, that it could never be rational to believe that D is our ideal competence description. And I was able to show this is the case by an argument that I sketched in this first lecture. I do not want to claim that this argument applies directly to our present discussion. We're not talking today about determining what is well confirmed, but with determining what the content of thoughts is. What did occur to me is this: what the Gödel theorem shows is that human reason is unable to survey itself well enough to see its own limits. That is to say, any description of our capacities that we're able to formalize is a description of a set of capacities that we're able to go beyond. But this suggests to me not that we can prove that functionalism can't be made less vague than it presently is, but that we have no reason to believe that it could be. In short, it suggests to me, first of all, if there is an ideal psychological theory, that is a theory that does everything that the functionalists want the description of human functional organization to do, let alone a normal form for the description of the functional organization of an arbitrary organism, then there's no reason to believe that it would be within the capacity of human beings to discover it. But secondly, the property of being a description of human functional organization is itself such an unclear property that the idea that there is such a description, even if we cannot recognize it, surely goes beyond the bounds of sets. I think I will stop here in order to leave time for discussion.